HPB has said that ethics are the most important thing about Theosophy. And that may come as a shock, but she felt that was far more important than anything else. And ethics, obviously, implies behavior. Ethics implies action, doing something. The central message of the Bhagavad Gita is action, isn't it? At least one of the main points of the Gita. Arjuna, as most of you know, is on the battlefield completely perplexed and feels he can't do anything. He's between the traditional rock and the hard place. So he says, I won't do anything. And that's the absolute worst thing anybody can do. And Sri Krishna gradually helps Arjuna to realize for himself that action is necessary. C.W. Leadbeater once said, those for whom there is the most hope are the actively good. The second group of people for whom there is the most hope is the actively evil, horrors of horrors. And the third is probably the likes of you and me who are relatively average. Why would he have said something so curious? Do you think maybe it has something to do with this primary law of this universe, action, reaction? If we do something, reaction follows, doesn't it? And that's how we learn, isn't it? From the feedback, from what hits us, from what we do. We put our hand in the fire, we learn it hurts, we don't do that again if we're sensible. So those who are actively good already have a clear motivation to the good. Those who are actively evil have learned a good deal, at least technically, but their motives are askew, and the reactions hit them hard, and they learn quickly. If we do a little bit here, a little bit there, we don't get too much either way, and there we are. Doesn't hurt bad enough for us to do something. So maybe there's something to this idea that Leadbeater had of the actively good being those for whom there is the most hope. But action is the way we learn. Experience. This was pressed upon us last night by Stefan, wasn't it? Now, what is this society supposed to do? I don't think we think about that so much anymore. We enjoy the talks, the books, we come and have fun with one another, and we have all sorts of beliefs. But I think to some extent, maybe we've lost track of what it is we're supposed to do. Now, the three objects of the society attempt to summarize what we're supposed to do, don't they? They attempt to do it as a collective society, as a society on a whole, and individual members of the society, what we're supposed to do. But then, of necessity, these objects are expressed in words. And some wise person once said, words were invented to conceal our thoughts. Now, that may not be totally true. But perhaps the grain of truth that is in it is words have no exact universal meaning. That is simply a fact. Therefore, words, of course, what are they? They express our perceptions and our concepts, don't they? That's what words do. They're, in a sense, symbols for ideas and for perceptions. But we don't all see things the same way, do we? We see things differently. And therefore, the same words may mean different things to different people. Isn't that certainly a very likely possibility, and in fact, the reality? And also, as time progresses, perceptions and concepts widely change, don't they, over history, over the time span. And new words come into existence, and old words die. The computer age has brought all sorts of new words in, hasn't it? I mean, now they're common speech. We use them all the time. They didn't exist before. The concepts weren't there, you see. So the words come in to express new concepts, new ways of doing things. Now, over time, the connotation of words tends to change before the denotation. I sound like John Algeo. I'm sure he could do this part better than me. But the connotation, it seems to me, changes first, and then the denotation. And some words are so radically different that they sometimes mean the exact opposite of themselves. Maybe this word always meant the exact opposite of itself. But anyway, should I ask you, what does cleave mean in English? What would you tell me? Means to stick together? In the old marriage rite, I think of the Anglican Church, cleave only unto her, but the woodsman cleaves the wood, separates it. So what does cleave mean? Tell me. Does it mean cut apart or stick together? And I want a single answer. You see, it isn't like that. It depends, doesn't it? So words do change in their meanings, and over time, some of them are rather amusing. Let me give you a few examples, amusing or not. Some of them are amusing. Gossip originally meant God-sib, that is, a sibling, God-sibling, a godparent, someone who stood for your child at the baptismal rite. Now clearly, a gossip, in the old sense, would be someone who was your friend, wouldn't it? You wouldn't choose a stranger or an enemy to stand for your child at baptism. So that word began to mean friends. Then it eventually meant what it means today. And who do we gossip to? A stranger on the street? Oh, no, 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 no. We see a friend and say, come in here and shut the door, I've got something to tell you. So you see how the word gossip has changed enormously over time. I learned from John that the word silly meant originally blessed. It now means stupid, doesn't it? How silly we were to have elected John Algeo as president. Well, I mean blessed. You see how we can be misunderstood. Science, of course, means knowledge. Well, there's some grounds in that still, isn't there? But in most people's mind, science means a particular intellectual pursuit that leads to technology. It does mostly in people's minds, doesn't it? That isn't the real meaning of science, but most people sort of see it that way. Conscience comes from two words, with knowledge. But we don't think of conscience as with knowledge so much, do we? We think of it as a prodding inside of ourselves to tell us when we've done something wrong. Oh, it never tells us when we should do something right. It just tells us when we've done something wrong. Comfort with strength. But what does it mean now? Soothing. Stroking the feathers. So words change. Examples and other examples, they're ambiguous words. Hot. Does it mean spicy, or does it mean high temperature? I'm constantly having to qualify it when Mary and I are having dinner at a restaurant. Oh, this is hot. I mean picante in Spanish, or caliente in Spanish. Mary will say caloric hot or spicy hot. So there's an ambiguous word. Those two don't really have a relationship, do they? Not really, because the one is a temperature that might burn the tongue. The other is an irritant, you see. Now, our puns are all based on the fact that words have double entendre. They don't always mean the same thing. There was a Protestant minister who on Easter Sunday said, "This being Easter Sunday, Mrs. Brown will come forward and lay an egg on the altar." Well, why do you laugh? Because lay means she could lay the... Oh, I see, if I can't deal with my glasses, I have another pair. You could lay the egg on the altar, or you could do what the chicken does. And that's why, of course, it's funny, because the word has two different meanings, doesn't it? At least. Fritz Kunz, who was a very good friend of mine, Johnny Kunz's father, told often a story that when he was in India, the Prince of Wales was visiting a town, and the Indians wanted to be kind and welcome him and show that they were glad to have him with them. And they held up signs. One sign said, "God save His Royal Highness." And the other sign said, "Lord help Her Royal Highness." Now you laugh. Why do you laugh? Because we could say, "Lord, help us to see Thy will," and you don't laugh. But "Lord, help Her Royal Highness" in that context is very funny. So the words don't always mean the same thing, do they? We might say, okay, I accept all that, but 99% of the time the context reveals the meaning. Really? Do you know that in the Jewish seminaries, rabbinical students are required, encouraged by tradition, argue with one another over the meaning of Torah, the 5 books of Moses? They get into shouting matches over what it means. This is encouraged because one of the great strengths of Judaism, from my point of view, is it has no required beliefs. In that, Judaism and Theosophy are similar. There are no absolute dogmas. What makes you a Jew is not what you believe, it's your ritualistic observances, etc., and your background, all those things. You can convert to Judaism. But it's not what you believe, you see. So words have very definite meanings, and when we use words that are sort of from the past, it suggests that we think as people tended to think in the past. Now, in our theosophical work, you thought I wasn't coming to this, didn't you? In our theosophical work, we must be very careful that the theosophical purpose and meaning are expressed in as unambiguous and as an inoffensive way as may be possible. Now, most of you know that one of the qualifications for the spiritual life cited in At the Feet of the Master is cheerfulness. But according to the Random House Unabridged Dictionary, one of the synonyms of cheerful is gay. I wonder if the writer of At the Feet of the Master had said, one of the qualifications for the spiritual life is to be gay. I wonder how that would be interpreted. But at the time, he could just as easily have chosen that word. If he had, would we not want to change it? I think we would be rushing to the press. Because it wouldn't mean that now. And who knows, maybe cheerful eventually will mean silly, blessed. See? So we must be aware that meanings change over time. Now, our objects have been written with words, but the objects are not the words. Can't emphasize it enough. The words can point toward the meaning, can suggest the meaning, but if it were the words only, I frequently have said, a tape recorder could become an enlightened being. It could repeat all the words very accurately. It isn't the words, is it? It's what we understand by the words that's the important thing. HPB was very firm on this point. She wrote a piece about jnana yoga, with which many of you are probably familiar, and in it she said toward the end of the little piece, no picture can ever represent reality. And words are pictures. They're statements, aren't they? And they paint a kind of picture. And that's what she meant, I think, that we mustn't be caught in words. We mustn't think that because it's written down and we have comprehended the words that we have really grasped the meaning. And she felt that reality was ever elusive and could never, ever, ever be captured in words alone and nailed down and put in stone. Stephan talked about the alternate tradition. We have to go beyond the words to the experience itself. Now, we heard yesterday morning about a Zen priest who was in a market and saw a little object, apparently food, and said, "What is that?" And what did they say? "A banana squash." And he went off content for a few minutes. I think we go off content for a lifetime frequently. Oh, now we know what it is. It's a banana squash. But do we know what it is because we can say banana squash? I don't think so. So we might ask, what are the objects of the Theosophical Society? And we'll hear the words. Oh, now we know. We're satisfied. It's a banana squash. But it isn't really the label. I wonder how many realize that our objects, the words, not the objects I don't think, but the words, have been changed no less than 8 times since 1875. Not recently, but 8 times. That's a lot of changes, isn't it? In 1875, the Society had one single object expressed in the plural. At least that's how I see it. It reads as follows: "The objects of the Society are to collect and diffuse a knowledge of the laws which govern this universe." Doesn't sound like our current objects. But that was the central purpose of the Society at its founding in 1875. In 1881, the second of 4 objects was to study Aryan literature, religion, and science. Well, one can surely see why that word cannot be used today. Aryan literature, raising immediately images of the Holocaust, so antipathetic to every theosophical principle. Yet at the time, it really meant the writers of the Vedas. And why would she have singled that out? Because in the West it was unknown, wasn't it, basically? We knew the Judeo-Christian scriptures. She wasn't against them. She quotes them frequently, talks about the ultimate unity of all great religious traditions. So she had nothing against any of them. The Kabbalah is praised absolutely tremendously in the Secret Doctrine, frequently quoted, the Jewish mystical tradition. So she wasn't against any of that, but the Aryan literature, that is the literature of the Vedas, was unknown, and it contained such wisdom, you see, so much that the West needed, and one of the purposes of the Society was to bring that out as well as the others, you see. So it was appropriate at the time, but soon got dropped. Now, our current objects are: 1, to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color. The second, to encourage the study of comparative religion, philosophy, and science. And the third, to investigate unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in man. Now, on the surface, they seem quite simple, I think. Brotherhood. Well, we should all live together peacefully and amicably, don't you think? Don't you think most intelligent people think that, really? We should learn to live together. The city of New York, I frequently say, is an experiment in international brotherhood, but there ain't many theosophists there. Yet we learn to live together, even if we're not terribly fond of one another, and work together and all that sort of thing in such an enormous city. Well, comparative study of religion, philosophy, and science. Well, it's a pretty good thing to get a broad education, don't you think? I mean, it's a very nice thing to have a wide view and learn about other cultures and religions and science and philosophy. That's what our universities do, isn't it? Attempt to do. Investigate the laws of nature. Well, yes, don't you think science is busy at that, making every effort to find out what these laws are? I want you to know that that reading of the objects of the Theosophical Society, interpreted in that way, which is the most obvious way to interpret them, nearly lost the property for the New York Theosophical Society some years ago. Emily Sellon and I, fortunately being reasonably articulate, had long sessions with our lawyers because the city wanted to remove the property tax exemption out from under us, because we were incorporated, and still are, as a religious organization. Not a religion, but a religious organization. And the tax people in the city of New York said, "Why do you call yourself a religious organization? What makes you religious?" So we read our objects. They said, that's not a religion. Didn't sound at all bigoted enough. No beliefs. And what are your beliefs? Well, we said we don't have any, you see. Well, but we think your objects are just lovely. We certainly think it's a nice thing, a really good thing. But you're not a religious organization. You don't deserve tax exemption, property tax exemption. You see? The words said one thing to them and perhaps something else to us. So what is the real purpose of the TS? What do those objects mean, and where do they come from? Well, let's begin with what I perceive to be the origin of the objects. They obviously, to me, arise out of the Theosophical philosophy itself, the Theosophical worldview. And although the three fundamental propositions of the Secret Doctrine were not written down as such until 1888, those three propositions, I think, clearly summarize as best as possible the essence of theosophical thought. Briefly stated and paraphrased, they are: the first proposition is that there is an eternal, boundless, immutable principle upon which all speculation and thought is impossible. Best described really as eternal, boundless, indivisible space. The only eternal, that which never changes, and out of which all arises, and into which all is reabsorbed. The second object is basically summarized as the principle of cyclicity or periodicity, that once a universe comes into being, order is immediately apparent, and that order expresses itself in the most fundamental way as cycles. Inward cycles, outer cycles, all motion is in some way or another cyclic. And the third fundamental proposition, basically summed up as: each individual soul is an aspect of the is one with the universal oversoul, which is itself an aspect of the unknown root. In other words, each soul is rooted in that eternal, unchanging, boundless reality. And gradually, over time, it develops. So, in two words, to summarize the third fundamental proposition: progressive development. Now, HPB suggests that those three most fundamental laws, from her point of view of this universe, are the basis of all laws, that all laws of nature derive from, are expressions of, variants of those three fundamental propositions. Now, let's look at the objects. If we can't take the words totally literally, let's use the words to see if we can probe a little deeper into what they might possibly mean. The first object: to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity, it begins. To form, action, do something, isn't it? It's not just to believe we're all brothers. To form, to do, to act. A nucleus. Well, a nucleus, that word, it could even sound a little bit elitist, couldn't it? It's almost contradictory to say a nucleus of universal brotherhood. I mean, you know, well, we're more brothers than you on the periphery, you see. You know that wonderful set of commandments in Animal Farm. All animals are equal, but some are more equal. So, are all human beings brothers, but some, that is, the Theosophists, more brothers? Well, I don't think it meant that. There's a very interesting change that happened in the objects, which I wonder, I do not know, I wonder if it occurred to someone that this elitist idea might have been latent in that expression. From 1881 to 1896, that object read: to form the nucleus of a universal brotherhood. You see how that subtle change works? The nucleus of a universal brotherhood. Lots of brotherhoods. How can there be lots of universal brotherhoods? So somebody saw that and tried to, I think personally, though I don't know the history of how it got changed, I think maybe they saw that it was better to change those two articles and say a nucleus of the universal brotherhood. Now, brotherhood. That's the central object of the first, central point, the central issue of the first object. Again, what is the universal brotherhood? I think these objects arise out of those three fundamental propositions, even though they were stated later. I mean, the essence of those fundamental propositions. Clearly, that relates to the first, it seems to me. And the word the universal brotherhood makes that more clear. There is only one indivisible reality in the background. And that's why we have brotherhood. It isn't because it's an ideal. It isn't because it's something we'd love to see operating, although that's all true too. It's because we are united. We are made of the same stuff and will return to the same. As the waves of the sea have their own independent existence, but they are nothing more or less than that eternal, boundless sea. So that seems to me to be the origin of the idea of brotherhood. So brotherhood is not, from my point of view anyway, simply a good social behavior. Let's be nice to one another, as the tax people thought it meant in New York City. It's possible it means something more. To me, it means a way of life which arises out of a realization of the ultimate unity of all. A realization that comes from our experience, a knowledge, a state of being, not a belief. I believe firmly in universal brotherhood. I must be honest, I have never fully experienced that. I'm one of those rare people who usually know the difference between what I know and what I believe. And what I know is indeed very small. Perhaps that's why, as I said before, the word the was substituted for a universal brotherhood. Now, the adepts feel very strongly about this first object, what we call our first object. Morius states, for example, "It is he alone who has the love of humanity at heart, who is capable of grasping thoroughly the idea of regenerating a practical brotherhood, who is entitled to the possession of our secrets." Hume once was a very arrogant man, as many of you know, and the adepts corresponded with him. And I remember once one of the adepts said, "The only interest Hume has in humanity is in its first syllable. As to mankind, he has no interest in it." K.H., the term universal brotherhood is no idle phrase. It is the only secure foundation for universal morality. If it is a dream, it is at least a noble one, and it is the aspiration of the true adept. Again, it's the realization of it, not just the belief. The second object, to encourage the study of comparative religion, philosophy, and science. To encourage the study, action again, you see. Do something, not just say, "Oh, isn't that a lovely idea?" We stand for the comparative study of. It's do it. Comparative study of religion, science, and philosophy. Now we come to another little word problem. Comparative. I believe this has been sort of already settled in the new well, not settled because the members must vote, but suggested in the new bylaw changes, although I must confess I didn't see them yet. I've always brought up this idea. Does comparative modify religion? Or does it modify religion, science, and philosophy? Do I say the study of comparative religion, science, and philosophy? Or do I say the comparative study of religion, science, and philosophy? As it's worded, you could do either one. I think they've suggest changing it to the comparative study of religion, science, and philosophy. Then you see the difference. If I'm just studying comparative religion, and then I'm studying science, and then I'm studying philosophy, they don't all mesh, do they? But everything in the primary literature, the Secret Doctrine, the Mahatma Letters, and so forth, all that literature stresses, everything in it points to the interpretation of the comparative study of religion, science, and philosophy, seeing how they go together. And what is meant by religion? Oh, that's an easy one, right? That's all these different sects out there, Buddhist, Christian, all of them, and the others, many of them. But that may not be the case. Well, you know how it was with God, don't you, when he was getting all these religions going? He said to the angels, now I'm going to have a little fun. Now you be quiet. I don't want you to laugh because they'll hear you, you see. So you've got to be quiet. So he said, I'm going to start with the Jews. You can't eat anything with a cloven foot. You can't do any work at all on a Saturday. You can only walk a short distance. You have to do this, that, and the other thing. All these endless laws. And the angel started to snicker. He said, shh, 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 stop it. They're doing it. They're doing it. They're doing it. He said, now I'm going to go to the Catholics. Stand up, sit down, kneel. Stand up, sit down, kneel. Shh, they're doing it. They're doing it. That's religion, huh? But you know where the word comes from. Religere, to bind back. We've lost sight of it, haven't we? We think of religion as cult, belief. But it means bind back, as yoga, I think, also means. So HPB seemed to have a much clearer view of this deeper meaning of religion. That's how she seemed to think of it. In fact, she said, in her collected writings, it is perhaps necessary to say that the assertion that Theosophy is not a religion by no means excludes the fact that Theosophy is religion itself. A religion in the true and correct sense is a bond uniting men together, not a particular set of dogmas and beliefs. Religion, in its widest meaning, is that which binds not only all men, but all beings and all things in the entire universe into one grand whole. Wow, that doesn't sound like religion. But if we look at religion that way, then perhaps we can see how it relates to the first and the third fundamental proposition, binding back to that incredible whole, and the third by progressive development, gradually revealed over time, binding back. Now what about science in the second object? Does that mean the technology that most people think? Or could it possibly mean not only science as we understand science, but the occult sciences, science of the subjective domain? I think it means both, the objective and the subjective domains. So it's a much broader definition of religion, a much broader definition of science that we're asked to look into. So if we see comparative as modifying religion, philosophy, and science, we can see how it relates to all three of those fundamental propositions, how those objects actually arise out of that philosophical view. Now the third object, to investigate unexplained laws of nature. Again, to investigate, action, do something. Every single object tells us not what to believe, it suggests what we're to do. And what is nature? We say, oh, I'm going out in the country, I like to be in nature. Is that all nature is? Oh, it's wonderful. It has a wonderful calming and therapeutic effect on us. The trees and the mountains, nothing can be more healthy and more calming. But that's not all there is to nature. From a theosophical view, every single atom is a life. Every single atom is part of nature. And nature is not only the objective side, it is the subjective side. So there's an inner side to nature as well as an outer side to nature. The devas, or angels, the inner side of the human being, because we too are part of nature. So when we're to study the unexplained laws of nature, it's a much bigger view, isn't it, than just to study the natural laws of physical nature. And what about the powers latent in man? Are they not really more than what might at first be thought? I think most people think of it as psychic powers. You know what HPB had to say about that? She said the psychic powers are transient. They perish with the temporal human being. That the most important thing is the ethics which take hold of the real human being, the enduring self. And what are those powers? We've heard about the psychic ones, even if we don't have them. I always say people really don't want to deal with the real inner side of theosophical thought, which means changing ourselves. That doesn't sound the slightest bit interesting. They would much rather see somebody glow in the dark. But the spiritual powers are really more important. And what are they? We heard something mentioned last night about one of them, emphasized in fact, compassion. That doesn't come from the lower nature, the so-called lower nature. I don't like that word really. The more transient part of our nature is a more accurate way of putting it. That comes from the inner nature, compassion, creativity, insight, and finally self-transformation. No other creature known on this planet has the possibility, so seldom used, of transforming oneself. What an awesome power that is latent in the human being. And the majority of our members, I think, from my experience, and I used to think as well, think of the psychic powers. Well, they're not to be excluded. They certainly are powers latent in the human being, and they're part of the study, but a fragment compared to that greater whole. Self-transformation, awesome power. So from the original objects in 1875 that were to collect and diffuse a knowledge of the laws which govern the universe, to the current objects, has there really been a change in the purpose? They sound so very different. I don't think so. I really don't. Because there is a single premise in the current objects, that of the universal brotherhood. And I believe that the 1875 object had as its purpose the intent to lead us to a realization of that premise. And it would seem to me that all the objects, whether in the 1875 version or the current ones, have that same central purpose. That is, to urge us to investigate, to find out, to experience for ourselves that ultimate ground of being which the premise postulates. It states the premise, universal brotherhood. Then it says investigate, search, study, find out, and that's how you'll know the premise is true, not by believing it. Otherwise, it's a very lovely belief, and maybe it helps a little. But it's the experience that counts. So to me, the true purpose of the society has never changed, but the words pointing toward that purpose has changed. Should we now change the wording of our objects? Well, perhaps. Should we leave the words as they are? Well, perhaps. The important thing is that we communicate as clearly as possible and as inoffensively as possible the purpose of the Theosophical Society. Its true mission, from my view, a mission to bring as many people as possible to experience the ground of all being, to know themselves as one with all in their own experience. That mission must never be lost or ever clouded by inappropriate or inadequate words. The earlier Theosophists realized this, and they never set anything in stone. I've called this talk The Objects Unveiled, but no one can really unveil the objects for us. They can only be unveiled by a search, by effort, by going beyond the words to meaning, and finally, by that flash of light we call insight, when the knower and the known are one. Thank you.